Welcome to the Fundamental Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Paul Saladino. This podcast is the result of my relentless search to understand and correct the roots of chronic disease and illness. In this podcast, I will share with you everything I have learned about how to live the most healthy and radical life possible. Thanks for joining me on this journey. What is up, you radical people? I am bringing you the first installment of the Ask Me Anything episode this week, and it is on fire. It is amazing. My buddy Nathan Owens joins me again for an installment in which we break down some incredible questions that you guys submitted, and we talk all about the game changers and all kinds of other good stuff. So in the beginning of this episode, we talk a little bit about Nathan's presentation at Low Carb Houston, where he is now. So the first 10 minutes or so are a summary of his theories around atherosclerosis. He and I agree about most of this. If you've heard my other podcasts regarding LDL and lack of evidence for its direct atherogenicity or direct pathogenicity, you will find this one quite interesting in the very beginning. Basically, neither Nathan nor I believe that LDL is harmful to the endothelium in and of itself, and we go into a little bit of detail talking about evidence to that effect. Then we go into the game changers. This has been on everybody's mind, and somebody asked a question about it, so I wanted to spend a decent amount of time in this AMA podcast breaking down some of the finer points here and refuting some of the poorly characterized science in that movie. One of the main things that we talk about is their assertion that animal foods specifically, or animal fats, worsen arterial function. We talk about flow-mediated dilatation, which is one of the measures that we can use as a proxy of arterial health. Now, in order to illustrate this, we talk about a bunch of studies, but I left one of the most important ones out, and I want to tell you guys about it in the intro real quickly to give you a teaser, to give you a sense of all the amazing stuff that is to come in this episode. The title of this study is Saturated Fats Do Not Impair Endothelial Function and Arterial Stiffness. This is a 2018 study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition, and it looked at replacing saturated fats in the diet with monounsaturated fats or carbohydrates, and they found no improvement in endothelial function or vascular function as measured by flow-mediated dilatation, which is something we go into detail about in this episode, and they looked at inflammatory markers. So what we find is that saturated fats are not harming our endothelium, as you'll hear us elaborate on greatly in this episode. Almost every single food we eat can affect flow-mediated dilatation of the arteries negatively. This is not always the best proxy for a measure of coronary artery disease risk or vascular function or heart disease risk, but it's something they talk about in the Game Changers, so we wanted to answer these criticisms. But there is clear evidence that saturated fats do not impair flow-mediated dilatation any more than unsaturated fats or carbohydrates. And as you'll hear in this episode, there's evidence that olive oil can impair it. There's evidence that potatoes can impair it. And we certainly know that glycemic loads, like an oral glucose tolerance test, can impair flow-mediated dilatation. So that is a really cool study with saturated fat that I left out, but I got it in there now. We're also going to talk about new 5GC. Got a lot of questions about this sialic acid. Dr. Gundry has been talking about it a lot, and I really wanted to debunk this one once and for all, at least on the airwaves of the podcast. It's certainly in my book. And then we talk about the gladiators, how they were going to be fat to prevent getting sliced up and bleeding everywhere, and why that led them to eat a lot of grains. And we basically break down a bunch of points from Game Changers and show how most of it's not very accurate at all. There's a blog post about Game Changers that is happening on my website. We have a 3-part installment coming with my friend Tim Rees, a nutritionist from the UK who currently lives in Germany. You can check that out on carnivoremd.com. While you're there, you can sign up for my newsletter. And if you guys love this podcast, please leave a review for me on iTunes. It is doing so good. It is reaching more and more people. If you find value here, leave me a review. That's how I get better rankings. Share it with your friends and family. We're already getting tens of thousands of downloads per week, and it is doing amazing. And I think we're affecting a lot of lives positively. I really try hard not to be dogmatic about the carnivore diet, not to be dogmatic about things in general. Obviously, I have a bias. I feel like the carnivore diet is super valuable in my own life and the lives of others, but I want to be open to other voices. And so in the coming weeks, I will have lots of dissenting voices coming on the podcast who I can hopefully have some open, friendly discourse with and see if we can share ideas and find some commonalities and maybe give you guys some idea of why we might differ and share the science behind that. So lots of cool stuff coming up. This AMA episode is going to blow your socks off. I think the actual expression is knock your socks off, but it's going to really rock your socks, okay? Another thing that rocks your socks is White Oak Pastures. I announced this on my Instagram this week. December 14th and 15th, White Oak Chella at Bluffton, Georgia, at White Oak Pastures. You guys are all invited. It's free. I'm going to be there for 2 days hanging out. I'm going to be podcasting with the owner, Will Harris. We're going to have butchering demos. There's going to be a big carnivore feast on Saturday night. That's the only thing that costs money. Otherwise, you guys can come. You can camp on the farm for free, or there is camping at Bagby State Park, which is about 20 minutes away. At White Oak Pastures, they have this 6th generation farm that has been in the family for 150 years. They are grass-fed, grass-finished beef. They have 11 different animal species, or 13. They have turkeys and pigs, Iberico pigs. They have all kinds of stuff. They have lamb. They have goats. Anyway, they have all kinds of stuff. They have ostrich. No, I don't think they actually have ostrich, but they have all kinds of amazing things at the farm that they're raising in this sustainable, regenerative agriculture model as sort of championed by Alan Savory, and the life cycle analysis at White Oak Pastures has shown that they are carbon negative. They are sequestering more carbon into the soil than they are producing. So any claims by people that ruminant agriculture is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions in any significant way are unfounded, especially when we support farms like this that are regenerative, grass-fed, grass-finished, and doing this incredible agricultural practices. So come out to White Oak Pastures, check it out, hang out with me, hang out with the Strong Sisters, hang out with some other good folks that are going to be there, and learn about this way that is agriculture of the future, the way it's always been done when animals are grazing on the land. If you go to whiteoakpastures.com, you can use the code CarnivoreMD for 10% off your first order, or Carnivore15 on a number of things that are on special on a week-to-week basis. To know which things are on special, you go to info.whiteoakpastures.com/CarnivoreMD. They're my peeps. They're doing good things. Support them and help everyone understand the way that this type of agriculture can change the face of the planet. My other peeps are the peeps at Ancestral Supplements, the fine men and women there, always sourcing grass-fed, grass-finished beef from the pristine lands of New Zealand. This is the land of Hobbit. This is the land of Frodo and the wizards. And if you've seen the Lord of the Rings, you know that New Zealand is amazing. If you guys haven't been there, you should go. But this is where Ancestral Supplements is sourcing their grass-finished organ complex and bone marrow from. They encapsulate it into these gelatin capsules that make it so much easier to take than eating the organs. As you all know, I am super big on using organs from animals, eating nose to tail. That is how we get the nutrients we need to complement the very rich muscle meat, but I think that there's not quite enough in muscle meat. So they have all kinds of cool stuff, Ancestral Supplements. And one of the really cool ones I want to tell you about this week is gallbladder. We go into gallbladder stuff in this episode of the podcast, and I talk about how crucial choline is. And the bile salts need choline to get from the liver canaliculi into the bile ducts and into the gallbladder. And so if you are having gallbladder issues, if you're not sure if you're having enough bile salts or you're having digestive issues, taking a gallbladder supplement can be really helpful, and Ancestral Supplements makes the best one on the market. Ancestrally, our native ancestors would commonly take a buffalo, cut it open on the spot, and eat the warm liver seasoned with the gallbladder and bile. It sounds a little gross to us, but they use it in the way we might use mustard. And it was thought of as a delicacy, and it did more than just improve the taste. The gallbladder and the bile within it helped concentrate all of the nutrients and building blocks that supported the biliary tract, including the choline, like I talked about, and all these other nutrients that go into making the biliary system work. And they're really absent from our modern diet. So if you have gallbladder issues, if you're not having a gallbladder anymore because you've lost a gallbladder on your way to the market or it got taken out during surgery, then check out the gallbladder supplement. This is one of their most popular ones, and I think it could be quite helpful for you. And listen in the podcast to the part where I talk about why gallstones form from a choline deficiency and how to get rid of them. Ancestral Supplements, these are my peeps. and they are putting back in what the modern world has left out. You can use the code SaladinoMD at their Shopify site for 10% off. And on to the podcast, my brothers and sisters in the good fight. I love and appreciate you all so much. Again, please leave me a review on iTunes if you like this. I love doing this, and you guys are going to dig this episode. Let me know what you think about this one. Listen after the episode to hear about what's going on with me. What is going on, everybody? Welcome to this week's episode. We are going to do an Ask Me Anything episode. And for this episode, I have my good friend, Nathan. What's going on, my man? How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm here in Houston. I was just attending Low Carb Houston.
And you and Nick gave a talk there, didn't you?
We did, yeah. Nick presented a talk that we put a lot of effort into. We condensed it down to 20 minutes, and folks can find that on YouTube at some point.
Why don't you give us a little summary? Tell us about this is kind of like your unifying theory, or the beginnings of your unifying theory about heart disease. Give us a quick summary of this, man. I think people will dig it.
Yeah, so Nick has found some really good pathology textbooks from back in the day from a guy named Konstantin Velikin. And he wrote this giant 500-page book called The Natural History of Coronary Atherosclerosis, and went through, from a pathology perspective, of actually slicing open people that have died from accidental death and from coronary heart disease, looking at what happened to them, what the lesions look like, how atherosclerosis develops. And basically none of it aligns with the current theory that LDL causes disease. So we went through and called that out. And then we kind of presented the idea that, the current theory doesn't explain all of the observations. There's quite a few, observations that don't line up, that the current theorists will refer to as paradoxes. So our kind of proposition is that atherosclerosis is majorly driven by serum endotoxemia, and that perhaps atherosclerosis is not the most important factor in myocardial infarction, which actually seems to be driven by acute immune activation, like stress or a cold or respiratory infection or something like that. But we think in the majority of the population, a crappy diet leads to gut dysbiosis, intestinal permeability, and increased serum endotoxemia, which then triggers focal immune responses in the coronary vessels just due to hemodynamics and blood flow. And that leads to atherosclerosis through immune activation, which then eventually causes lipid accumulation, things like that.
So, I guess Tommy Wood and I have talked a little bit about postprandial endotoxinemia a bit. This is passage of lipopolysaccharide into the bloodstream, probably has to do with gut inflammation and some gastrointestinal hyperpermeability, immune activation. Yep. People who have listened to this podcast in the past will know that lipopolysaccharide is part of the gram-negative cell wall, and it's quite immunogenic. And many foods, there are many experiments that can show some degree of postprandial endotoxinemia or endotoxemia. But I think that, as you are alluding to, probably the proximate problem for postprandial endotoxemia is dysbiosis in the first place, overgrowth of gram-negative aerobic organisms like Proteobacter and things like this. So it kind of comes back to the idea that we need to have a healthy gut. And if the gut is unhealthy and we are constantly putting stuff in the gut that is going to irritate the gut, that is going to trigger the immune system, that is going to cause leaky gut, we could be getting immune activation. That immune activation could be triggering systemic inflammation. And that certainly we know can make both LDL and lipid blood vessels, or our arterial blood vessels, or all blood vessels in the body, more sticky, more proteoglycans. And you get this sort of LDL stickiness in the blood vessels. So yeah, interesting. Okay, cool. So what was it about when the pathologist looked at these arteries? What was it about those arteries that suggested that LDL was not the problem?
Well, there's a lot of observations that don't line up. There are actually maybe up to 12 types of lesions, and some of them actually have less LDL in them than a healthy artery wall. And just the timeline doesn't line up. Like, people like to claim that fatty streaks that are seen in childhood are the start of atherosclerosis, but the evidence suggests that those are actually a completely separate phenomenon that are not related to what later become complex lesions that are prone to rupture. And it actually seems to be plaque stability and plaque rupture that's the issue, not so much the plaques themselves. You can actually have a almost completely occluded coronary artery and appear totally healthy and still be running marathons or what have you, and not have a heart attack and be totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, from my days as a PA in cardiology, I certainly remember that you can have 60, 70% occlusion of a coronary artery, and if the plaque doesn't rupture, it's not a problem or it's not an issue. Probably it's not. I think there's probably something going on. If you have a plaque that's that big that it's stenosing the artery, there's some kind of pathologic process going on there. One of the other things, because I just love freaking talking about atherosclerosis, and then we'll dive into the AMA questions. I heard Malcolm Kendrick on a podcast. So he's Scottish, I believe, and he's one of the main guys kind of advancing this idea of cholesterol skepticism, LDL skepticism. And he mentioned, maybe, did you guys come across this, that there's actually that what's found in a plaque is cholesterol crystals, not cholesterol ester crystals.
Yeah, so that's actually something we've been digging into. There's not very many studies on the contents of plaques, but the cholesterol that is found in plaques tends to be mostly free cholesterol.
Right.
But the cholesterol carried inside of lipoproteins is esterified cholesterol.
Right.
And the suggestion is that even the esterified cholesterol that's found is actually esterified in situ. So once it's gotten in there. So it's likely that the source of the free cholesterol came from the membrane of red blood cells that were trapped after a clot occurred and was then kind of built into the lesion. Because in like a fibrous lesion, you actually see like layers and layers of clots that have been healed over. And that would explain why free cholesterol is trapped in there. And then you also find that things like fibrin in the blood accumulate at the same rate as LDL and in the same ratios. So it's not just LDL being pulled in, it's other things as well.
And Malcolm Kendrick also talked about these endothelial progenitor cells that can circulate and in the blood and then attach to the endothelium and kind of sandwich onto the top of an atherosclerotic lesion or a damaged arterial wall. So that I think the hypothesis here is that if the endothelium gets damaged, and in this AMA, we're going to talk about a lot of things that damage endothelium. The endothelium is the inner lining of our blood vessels. So the inner lining of arteries and veins, which have a glycocalyx kind of forest of proteoglycans sticking up from them. And if the endothelium gets damaged, it appears that these endothelial stem cells, these endothelial progenitor cells, can come along and stick themselves onto that damaged spot, thereby taking something that was exposed to the circulation and putting it below an endothelial progenitor cell, which is such that could be the way that we're getting a blood clot in an artery because we're in the wall of an artery, because we are sort of adding pieces of bread to this part of the sandwich. We're like adding, I mean, any of the food metaphors that are anything other than meat always irk me. I don't want to talk about sandwiches, but it's people understand it. Like we're basically, you have the open face of the sandwich and you're just adding an endothelial progenitor cell that kind of closes it back up. And therefore the peanut butter and jelly look like they're on the inside of the arterial wall. That is the clot. But in effect that was at one time on the surface, and then it just got pushed down to the middle by this endothelial progenitor cell. But this idea that I love this concept that there's so much evidence that LDL is not what is driving atherosclerotic plaque formation. Whether it's the pathological inconsistencies, whether it's the timeline, whether it's all of the stuff that I've talked about previously, and I talk about much more in the book about inconsistencies in levels of LDL and risk of coronary artery disease, other things that are much bigger risks, the statin trials.
And we have fun stuff like drugs that lower LDL prevent coronary events.
Drugs that lower LDL and don't prevent coronary events. Right, exactly. So, yeah, it's just, there's so many things that argue against the notion that LDL alone is, number one, enough to initiate an atherosclerotic plaque, and number two, really the main driver of atherosclerosis moving forward, which has great implications for what we are doing in the ketogenic and carnivore space, because many of us have LDLs that are higher than normal, but normal, quote unquote, but also look very insulin sensitive with low fasting insulin, high HDL, low triglycerides. We're going to talk a lot about triglycerides in this. All right. So tell us more about this thing that Dave announced.
Yeah, Dave Feldman announced the Citizen Science Foundation at Low Carb Houston, which he started to do a measurement project initially for lean mass hyperresponders, folks who have high LDL, low triglycerides, and high HDL. And they're going to try and do stuff like a coronary artery calcium scan and a CT angiogram on these folks. So we can actually isolate people who have high LDL, but all of their other biomarkers are great.
And I will tell you from personal experience in my medical practice that I have a number of clients who have had persistently negative coronary artery calcium scores despite highly elevated LDL. And there's at least a few examples of people who have had regression of coronary artery calcium score or coronary artery calcium plaque on CAC scoring with high LDLs. One of my clients has an LDL over 300 for many years and has had a persistently zero CAC score. So, and then I think that the more convincing ones are where people have had quite high LDLs in ketosis or carnivore diets and have regression of their CAC score. So I love it. This LDL paradigm is going to crumble because it is just not the problem, but it is so hard to undo all the things we've been told for so long. So I hopefully we're a part of that. And I think that there are coronary risk factors and atherosclerosis is real and people can get heart attacks, but it's not only about LDL. It's about much more than that, isn't it?
Exactly.
So, I mean, from your opinion, from your perspective, what are the biggest drivers here and how do people go about preventing the progression of atherosclerosis?
Yeah, I think the biggest drivers are immune related. So folks who have autoimmune conditions are probably at greatest risk. And then probably diet related factors and intestinal permeability factors. So in our talk, we kind of suggested that we think that the kind of no duh answer is eat a diet consisting of evolutionarily consistent whole foods. And that probably allows your digestive system to handle things. So, and then the most extreme case of that, of course, is a carnivore diet where you're just removing anything that could really be any kind of problem. And we hope to do tests on this so we can measure endotoxin levels in ourselves, myself and Nick, who are carnivores, and then some friends who are, healthy but need a mixed diet. And then we hope to find someone with type 2 diabetes or other issue and test their levels and see, who has the lowest postprandial endotoxin absorption.
That would be super interesting. There certainly are many people throughout the world who are eating a mixed omnivorous diet and are very healthy and avoid atherosclerosis. But for a lot of people, myself and you included, a carnivore diet works really well for that. And one of the most interesting papers that keeps coming up in all of my writing of the book and all of my talking with Tommy Wood and you is this survey of metabolic dysfunction in Westernized Americans. And the striking statistic, I think I've shared this with you, Nathan, is that 87.8% of the American population has some degree of metabolic dysfunction. So 88% of the population is doing this wrong, but at least 12% of the population is doing okay.
Yeah, and that's quite the confounder in a lot of studies. I think it makes things difficult because it's hard to find people who are actually healthy unless you really dig in.
Yeah, and that's what I talked about with Tommy Wood in the ApoE4 episode that we did, that when you're swimming in dirty water, everything's going to look a little different. And there are some fascinating studies of people who are not insulin resistant, but you have to almost look at these indigenous populations. And those are where you see discordances in things like ApoE4 and some of these other factors like the Simene or the Simane, the Bolivian Simane from the ApoE4 podcast. But when we study populations of people who are like the 12% of Westernized Americans who are not insulin resistant, things look a lot different many times. So
yeah, exactly.
All right, let's jump into the AMA questions, man. Let's roll.
Let's do it. So the Game Changers movie just came out. What do you think about that? And are the claims that are made in that accurate?
So on my website, which is carnivoremd.com, my good friend and nutrition, Tim Rees, and I are doing a multi-part blog series in which we are breaking down Game Changers and showing the inconsistencies in the presentation here. For anyone who's not familiar with this movie, it's a documentary on Netflix produced by some pretty heavy-hitting people in Hollywood with a lot of money behind it. There's a big push in this space. The problem is that many of the people that are funding this movie are also funding big plant-based interests. They clearly are vegans, and this is not an unbiased piece of movie making. This is definitely a bent toward plant-based claims and plant-based ideology. So we're going to break down a few of the claims that are made in that movie and talk about why they're not accurate. And as you'll see the blog post of all on my website, we'll go into more detail there too. On the website, one of the first things that Tim talks about in his guest blog post is the claim by the folks from the Game Changers movie production team that the gladiators were vegan. And this is not true. The gladiators were not vegan. They definitely ate meat, but they also ate a lot of plant-based foods. And there's historical evidence that they did this much like the sumo wrestlers do in Japan in order to get really fat, because fat is like armor when you're getting hit with a sword. And fat is going to bleed a whole lot less than a lean guy. So if Nathan or I go into the gladiator ring and we're hitting each other with swords, or hopefully not hitting each other, maybe we're hitting somebody else with swords, and we get hit with a sword and we're lean, there's a good chance we're going to bleed a whole lot more than someone that has more adiposity in the subcutaneous region under the skin. So the claim about the gladiators is quite misleading and probably had to do with the fact that that's a survival advantage when you're getting poked with things or cut with a sword so you don't bleed all over the place, not for long-term health or bravery or strength or anything like that. The other thing, one of the other main inconsistencies in this movie is the inaccurate use of epidemiology, or I should say the unqualified use of epidemiology. There are some comments in the movie by Dean Ornish, who's a well-known plant-based advocate physician, stating that that in meat eaters, there's a 75% increase in all-cause mortality and a 300% increase in cancers. Now, the problem with this is the kind of stuff that just gets me so riled up, because this is epidemiology that he's citing. It's not an interventional trial. And I've talked about this time and time again on my podcast, that what he's referring to are specific Western cohorts of people who are asked about meat consumption and then surveyed for health outcomes. And the researchers are noting a correlation without being able to comment on causal effect or causal connection. So he's really using epidemiology irresponsibly, in my opinion, when he's talking about this. This is a big issue. And the problem with epidemiology, as we know, is there can be so many biases and confounders. If you heard the debate I did with Lane Norton, you heard me say healthy user bias time and time again. Healthy user bias is the idea that when people are eating fruits and vegetables, because humans have been told to eat, because westernized humans have been told to eat fruits and vegetables for the last 70 years, those are people who are also doing other healthy behaviors. And it is very unlikely to be the fruits and vegetables that are benefiting them, rather than the healthy behaviors, the exercise, the sunlight, the increased sleep, the better financial status, the visiting the doctor more often, these healthier behaviors, spending time in community. These are what we're seeing in these epidemiology studies, not an effect from the fruits and vegetables or the absence of the eating the meat. And how do we know this? Well, a number of ways. The epidemiology looks very different when we go to Asia. And in Asia, the paradigm or the narrative has been much different than it is in the West. In Asia, the narrative for the last 60 to 70 years is that eating meat allows you to be healthy, and that eating meat is for people who are rich and affluent, or it's associated with a higher social status. And so eating meat in the West we've been told that's bad for us and the vegetables are good. But in Asia, they've been really told this narrative that eating meat is what people who are successful do. So when we look at epidemiology studies in Asia, we see the complete opposite set of data arising, but Dean Ornish won't talk about these because they break his hypothesis down pretty quickly. One study that I've quoted before is titled Meat Intake and Cause-Specific Mortality, a pooled analysis of Asian prospective cohort studies. People can look this one up if they want. It's a study of over 200,000 men and women from Bangladesh, China, Japan, Korea, and Taiwan. They were followed for 6 to 15 years. And what they found was that in the men that ate the most red meat, there was the lowest rate of cardiovascular mortality. And in the women who ate the most red meat, they had the lowest cancer mortality. Now, this is why epidemiology is so misleading. You can go in the West where there's an underlying narrative and there's this healthy user bias and this unhealthy user bias based on what we've been told, or you can go to the East where there's a completely different narrative and get completely divergent findings. Dean Ornish isn't going to talk about this, but when vegans or plant-based advocates are talking about studies which suggest harm from meat or benefit to eating fruits and vegetables, invariably they are quoting epidemiology because interventional studies suggesting this do not exist. When we look at the interventional studies of animal protein versus plant protein, or interventional studies of animal models where animals are given meat, we do not see problems. And so the interventional studies is what we should really be looking at. But in the Game Changers movie, they don't talk about this. People who are advancing plant-based agendas don't talk about this at all. They're just talking about epidemiology. And again, epidemiology is badly, consistently confounded by health user bias and unhealthy user bias. And the latter, unhealthy user bias, is when the James Dean type of rebels say, you know what, I'm going to eat meat because I like it. And they do lots of other unhealthy behaviors as well. So that can make it look like people who are eating meat are unhealthy or have worse outcomes because of their unhealthy behaviors. And I've talked about this with Tommy Wood, I believe, in a previous podcast looking at the UK shoppers study. And what they did in that study was they separated the all-cause or the death rate for vegetarians and the general population, and they see that the vegetarians have a better death rate. They have a lower death rate. But when they take the people out of the general population who are having healthy behaviors, and they compare vegetarian death rates, called the death rate ratio in vegetarians, to those in the general population, this is in the UK, who have healthy behaviors, the rate of death is the same. So you can compare people who are vegetarian to people who are omnivores. Both groups have healthy behaviors now. You see that the death rates are the same. So really the research continues to point to the fact that it's not about the plants being good or the meat being bad. It's about which group of people is doing the healthy behaviors.
That makes a lot of sense.
And I'll just mention a couple of the interventional trials so people can look these up. Effects of plant and animal high protein diets on immune inflammatory biomarkers, a 6-week intervention trial. And in this 6-week intervention trial, they divided people into 2 groups. They all had diabetes, so they were all metabolically unwell. And one group was given a diet that was high in plant protein, and one group was given a diet that was high in animal protein. And at the end of the study, after 6 weeks, there were really no significant differences in any of the inflammatory markers between the 2 groups. I will notice that in that study, the calprotectin was higher in the plant-heavy group. Calprotectin is one of the markers of GI inflammation, but I don't think that reached statistical significance. But you'll notice that when these 2 groups are compared, there's no difference in the inflammatory markers between them. Similar studies like that have been done time and time again. Another study, isocaloric diets high in animal or plant protein reduced liver fat and inflammation in individuals with type 2 diabetes. In this study, they gave 2 groups of diabetic patients isocaloric diets which were calorie deficient, and both groups lost weight and improved equally. Both groups had improvement in the markers of inflammation, markers of liver function, and neither group had major problems with the higher protein diet, suggesting that a high animal protein diet is not going to hurt someone with diabetes, is not going to worsen with diabetes, is not worse than a higher plant-based diet for diabetes. So when animal and plant protein diets are compared head to head, we don't see any negative effects of the animal protein diet on people, as many of these plant-based advocates would argue for. So that's just inconsistent reporting on their part, and irresponsible use of the epidemiology. So without belaboring that, we'll move on. So there was a whole nother part of the Game Changers where they talked about, I think, flow-mediated dilatation, and they did this striking experiment where they gave someone a high-fat diet and then spun the blood down and showed that after the high-fat diet, this guy's blood was cloudy. But Nathan, you and Nick repeated this one. Why don't you tell us about your repeating of the cloudy blood serum experiment?
Yeah, so we saw Dave Feldman tweet out that he wanted to try and replicate this. So we decided to replicate it. Not exactly. So in the movie, they had people eat either a burrito with avocado or a burrito with chicken and cheese. And the person who ate the burrito with chicken and cheese had cloudy serum, which was implying, high triglycerides in the blood. So Nick and I, who both eat a carnivorous diet, we cooked up a bunch of lamb chops, loin chops with a bunch of fat on it. Then we scrambled some eggs in the leftover fat, and we drank some kefir, waited 2 hours as they did in the movie, took our own blood. And then we spun it on a centrifuge and we looked at the serum, and it was perfectly clear after eating probably 100 grams or more of fat. The only way that I was able to replicate it was eating as much as I could at Fogo de Chao, and then on top of that, consuming probably 6 ounces of heavy whipping cream, which was probably 300 plus grams of fat. And then my triglycerides went up 5 hours later to 300 milligrams a deciliter. And at that point, my blood was cloudy.
In the first experiment, when you and Nick ate lamb chop, you ate basically all meat with some fat, and it was over 100 grams of fat. What were your postprandial triglycerides?
Yeah, our fasting triglycerides, Nick's was below the measurement range of the cardio check, so it was probably below 50, so 40 to 45, I would guess, based on his lab tests. Mine were about 70 fasted, and I believe Nick's were 60 postprandial, and mine were 70 again.
So in the first experiment you guys did with a large amount of meat and a large amount of fat, over 100 grams of fat, there was no increase in postprandial triglycerides. And when you guys spun the blood down, it wasn't cloudy. Now, I should just mention to people, when we're talking about this cloudy blood, what we're really reflecting is triglycerides, maybe some degree of free fatty acids, but probably also triglycerides in chylomicrons, in VLDL, in LDL, in IDL. But we're really looking at like blood fat levels. And what Nathan is saying here is that when he ate a meal, so this is Nathan and Nick, both of whom are metabolically healthy, neither of whom have insulin resistance. They were both able to eat a meal that was very high in protein and very high in fat and had no postprandial change in triglycerides and then no change in the visual quality of the blood, meaning that the blood wasn't cloudy as they claimed it would be in Game Changers. Then Nathan and Nick did a second experiment where they went to Fogo de Chao, ate a ton of meat, and because Nathan wasn't satisfied, he wanted to see how much he could do. He then drank a whole bunch of heavy whipping cream, and actually, as you said, when you did that experiment, you were able to get some cloudiness in your blood with a ton of heavy whipping cream. And we can hypothesize about what's going on there, but I should note that Nick also ate at Fogo de Chao with you, and his didn't move at all. He had much less fat. So it appeared that, at least for you, Nathan, whether it was the dairy specifically or something about that large amount of dairy fat, you had kefir in the first experiment. So it's hard to know if that was what was going on. But
we had cheese too in the first experiment.
Wow. Okay. So it was perhaps the very large amount of dairy fat that in the second experiment did create some postprandial increase in triglycerides and made the blood kind of cloudy. But
And this is something that you would expect eating a large amount of fat. I mean, it has to be trafficked to adipocytes some kind of way. So
right.
As long as it's not chronically elevated, I don't think that this is actually something that I'm concerned about, although I don't tend to eat 300 grams of fat a day.
Or at one meal.
Correct, yeah.
Or 6 ounces of heavy whipping creaming all the time. And we'll talk later in the AMA about dairy and my concerns about dairy specifically. I know you guys are going to repeat this experiment. I would love for you guys to repeat the experiment with different types of fat and see if there's something about the dairy fat that does it. I guess the first experiment is pretty impressive that you could eat over 100 grams of fat and not see this happen. But I wonder at what point the actual switch was and the blood triglycerides became elevated. But in the game changers, one guy eats a burrito with avocado and the other guy eats a burrito with chicken and cheese. You're thinking, that's not an excessive amount of fat. What is going on there? We don't really know much about that person's health, but based on what you guys have seen here, I think you agree with this, would suspect that to get postprandial increase in triglycerides, I suspect the person eating the chicken and cheese burrito may not have been metabolically healthy at baseline.
Exactly. Because that could only contain maybe 20 grams of fat.
Yeah, and the way that person is trafficking it is unusual. Based on what you guys have seen, that doesn't necessarily happen, even with larger amounts of fat. Yep. And I think that the claim from the folks in the Game Changers is that this amount of fat in the blood is going to impair blood vessel dilatation or is bad for the endothelium. So I want to talk a little bit about the flow-mediated dilatation experiments that have been done and what we know about flow-mediated dilatation. I believe that in the Game Changers, they are claiming that when you eat meat or when you eat these high-fat animal-based meals, you impair the ability of the artery to expand or dilate after the meal. Now, this is, again, another very misleading claim. And the experimental intervention that they're talking about is flow-mediated dilatation, which is not the best measure for really atherosclerotic risk, heart disease risk, or any of these things. It's measured with an ultrasound after partial occlusion of an artery, where the experimenters will inflate a blood pressure cuff around an arm and occlude the brachial artery for some amount of time. And then when blood flow is restored to the brachial artery, there should be a dilatation in the artery, which we can measure with an ultrasound probe. Now, there have been experiments looking at flow-mediated dilatation for years and years and years, and lots of different foods have been studied to see how they affect flow-mediated dilatation. And the inference here is that flow-mediated dilatation gives some sort of an indication of of atherosclerotic risk or of risk of developing future heart attacks or of risk of insulin resistance. What we do know is that in people who are diabetic and insulin resistant, metabolic syndrome, flow-mediated dilatation is impaired at rest. But in healthy individuals, flow-mediated dilatation is not impaired. Now, when both groups of people are given a variety of foods, we then see an impairment in flow-mediated dilatation postprandial. Diabetics, insulin-resistant individuals are impaired at baseline, and they get worse. And even people who are healthy and not impaired at baseline get postprandial impairment in flow-mediated dilatation with a variety of foods. But I think that the reason people feel that flow-mediated dilatation is valuable is because the diabetics have it at rest, and so they're worried that the rest of us shouldn't have it at all. But as you and I discovered, Nathan, in some of our research, there are many foods which will cause a decline or a dysfunction in flow-mediated dilatation that are throughout all plant and animal kingdoms, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So, I mean, what did we find here? We found a study that showed that olive oil in bread can cause a decrease in flow-mediated dilatation, right?
Yep, bread, potatoes, pretty much eating anything. is kind of a stressful event on the body and seems to have some impact on FMD.
So one of these studies we found is the postprandial effect of components of the Mediterranean diet on endothelial function, if people want to look this up. And these are 10 healthy, normal lipidemic subjects, and the meals contain different fat sources: olive oil, canola oil, and salmon. 2 olive oil meals also contain antioxidants or foods like balsamic vinegar and salad. And what they found was that all 5 meals significantly raised serum triglycerides, and the olive oil meal reduced FMD 31%. And so there was an inverse correlation observed between postprandial changes in serum triglycerides and FMD, meaning that the higher the triglycerides, the worse the FMD was, or the change in the FMD was. But isn't that interesting that you can give someone olive oil, something that many would consider to be a healthy food and is vegan and is something that's touted by plant-based advocates, Stephen Gundry, and you see this decrease in FMD too. I think the takeaway point here is that so many things, another one you said was the potatoes, which is from a study called Changes in Meal Composition and Duration Affect Postprandial Endothelial Function in Humans. And as has been noted repeatedly in both normal and diabetic subjects, during an oral glucose tolerance test, there's a decrease in flow-mediated dilatation in the artery, meaning that giving someone 75 grams of glucose is going to cause these arteries to not dilate properly or as we would hope. Now, that, as we'll talk about, that's going to get in the blood very quickly. That's going to be very high glycemic index. That's going to cause a very abrupt increase in blood glucose levels, which is something that we also know can impair endothelial function in and of itself. But the claim that animal foods uniquely impair endothelial function or flow-mediated dilatation is just false. And as Nathan is suggesting, the research appears to indicate that basically almost anything we eat is going to change the way our arteries respond to occlusion and then flow-mediated dilatation. And what's more important than a change in FMD is how quickly it rebounds to normal, right, Nathan?
Yeah, I think that's also important to look at. And like, for example, I tend to only eat 1 meal a day, so I'm hopefully reducing any kind of impact from that may occur.
And I think there are some studies which show that as we develop hyperglycemia, as we develop insulin resistance, the degree of flow-mediated dilatation impairment is going to be extended. So this almost mirrors the mTOR argument a little bit. And mTOR is the mammalian target of rapamycin. So many people have questioned, and I've talked about this on multiple podcasts in the past, but so many people say, do you worry about mTOR on a carnivore diet? To which my answer is no, because leucine, the protein in animal meat, only triggers mTOR for a short amount of time and then it turns off. Whereas insulin, which is going to be much higher when you're eating a protein-rich meal in the setting of a mixed diet, when you're not in ketosis, or a carbohydrate-rich meal, when your insulin is bumped, which is if you're on a glucose-based diet or a carbohydrate-based diet, whether you're eating protein or carbohydrates, that is going to trigger mTOR much more and for a much longer time. And we see the same pattern with FMD, that the length of time that it's triggered, the changes in FMD are triggered, are probably more important, and they're different with different foods. And that the glucose and the more, I would say, insulinogenic foods appear to be more impairing of FMD postprandially. So just like if you were eating carbohydrates throughout the day, you could trigger your mTOR throughout the day. It appears that if you're on a carbohydrate-rich diet, you could also trigger, as Tommy Wood and I have talked about, these postprandial mean glucose excursions, these MAGEs. So as if your glucose bumps after your meal, something you might see on a continuous blood glucose monitor, then you're potentially going to be impairing the endothelium. You could have changes in flow-mediated dilatation, and that could last for a longer amount of time. So again, there's a lot of nuance here that is not being discussed in this movie. The last thing that they did in this movie with, I believe it was with FMD, was they looked at this one study that had avocado and hamburger. And in the study, I'm not completely sure if the hamburger had a bun or not. The bread would certainly be a pretty big confounder, but let's assume that there was no bun given with the hamburger. The name of the study is Haas Avocado Modulates Postprandial Vascular Reactivity and Postprandial Inflammatory Responses to a Hamburger Meal in Healthy Volunteers. And what they found in this study was that the FMD was better, or there was no change in FMD when they gave the burger with an avocado, but there was a change in FMD when they gave the burger by itself. And why don't you tell us what you thought of this study, Nathan? Because I thought you had some pretty astute observations here.
Yeah, I think that the main thing that this study could be looking at is changes in gastric emptying time. So how long it takes to digest the food, since the avocado adds obviously additional fat, but also additional fiber, and changes the fatty acid composition a bit. So I think that could just be indicative of how long the meal took to exit the stomach, basically.
Yeah, and so this is a major flaw in this study that I see as well, that when they measured flow-mediated dilatation, which in this study they call a PAT score, which is a similar measure of arterial reactivity, but when they measured the arterial reactivity postprandially, they only did it at 2 hours. And then they probably should have done it out to 5. And what I suspect, and I think what Nathan suspects, is that they would have seen a drop in the PAT score or the flow-mediated dilatation if they'd waited just a little bit longer, likely because of decreased gastric emptying and slowed gastric emptying when the fat and fiber were added to the protein. So this is a pretty big confounder in the study. I think it's a pretty big logical error they made here. But one thing that's quite interesting to note about this study as well is that they looked at some inflammatory markers. And they're also saying that serum IL-6 bumped in the burger patty, but the avocado addition attenuated the bump in interleukin-6. And what's quite fascinating about that claim of theirs is that bump in interleukin-6, which is an inflammatory cytokine, happened at 4 hours. And it only bumped once, and then it came back to normal. So it's hard to know if that's actually a real bump in interleukin-6, which can be both a pro-inflammatory or anti-inflammatory cytokine. But that would also suggest that they're looking at flow-mediated dilatation at 2 hours. And if there's any change in serum cytokines, they happened at 4 hours, but they didn't even look at flow-mediated dilatation at 4 hours. So this whole thing is a little bit suspect in both of our opinions. And this is one of the main studies that I think the majority of the scientific evidence in Game Changers is based on, and it's clearly not telling the whole story with regard to that. So pretty misleading stuff, unfortunately, here. I think this is not doing anybody any favors. Do you think we covered that enough? Yeah,
I think so. I think okay. that gives people a good overview.
Okay. So take home. Oh, we also want to talk about New 5GC. Take home so far with Game Changers, gladiators got fat to stay alive. Dean Ornish's comments are about epidemiology, which is non-reproduced outside of this country. Interventional studies do not show harm with meat. Flow-mediated dilatation is probably not the best measure of cardiovascular risk and is impaired when we eat anything. It's probably more about insulin sensitivity and having it return to normal. There have been multiple studies which showed impairment in FMD with even plant-based foods. And then the last one is New 5GC. So a lot of people asking about New 5GC. I've commented on this before. I talk about this in the book. But I want to talk about this as well just to help people understand it, because I know that Stephen Gundry, who is a friend of mine, but we disagree on many things, has been saying that New 5GC is a problem. So New 5GC, what the heck is this? It is a glycoprotein found on the outside of our cells, meaning that it is a protein molecule, kind of like the glycocalyx on the endothelial cells or on the cells that line our gut. It is a glycoprotein molecule which sticks out from cells composed of protein and carbohydrate. And it belongs to a family of molecules called sialic acids. Now, humans don't have Nu5GC. We have Nu5AC and other sialic glycoprotein molecules on our cells, but we don't have Nu5GC. And we eat animals that do have Nu5GC. Specifically, red meat is a source of Nu5GC. So many who deride the benefits or seek to denigrate red meat or its benefits or say that it's bad for us have latched on a Nu5GC saying, aha, this is something that could explain the mechanism of colon cancer for red meat, which is kind of silly when you think about it. If you actually look at the studies, I've talked about this previously. I'm not going to go into it today. The evidence that red meat causes colon cancer is essentially laughable. But the pundits who argue for the potential dangers of Nu5GC will say maybe this is a mechanism for red meat causing cancer or inflammation because our bodies perceive this sialic acid in the food we eat as a foreign molecule when we eat it. And it's known that humans do generate antibodies to Nu5GC. There are no studies. There are 0 studies in humans showing a danger for Nu5GC. Nobody's ever looked at this. So when Stephen Gundry is saying that Nu5GC is a problem, I will just say this, unfortunately, he doesn't always tell what study or mention what study he's referencing to back his claims. But the only study that I have seen in the literature that shows a detriment to this is in mouse, in the mouse model. Now, this is kind of contrived because mice have Nu5GC, and they had to do a knockout mouse and then introduce the mouse with Nu5GC antibodies and then present the mouse with Nu5GC containing food. And at this point, the model becomes so contrived that I'm not sure that it's relevant for humans. But there is a very interesting study in humans from September of 2018, and the title of this study is No Increase in Colon Cancer Risk Following Induction with Nu5GC Bearing Rabbit Anti-T Cell IgG in Recipients of Kidney Transplants. I know you guys all just fell asleep because that title was too long and boring, but I'll break it down for you real quick and then we'll move on. In kidney transplantation, sometimes patients are given rabbit polyclonal IgG, meaning they're given a mix of immunoglobulins from rabbits. They're given a mix of immunologic molecules from rabbits, and that contains Nu5GC because rabbits have Nu5GC, and that elicits an immune response against Nu5GC. So what they thought was, well, let's look at the people who got the rabbit polyclonal IgG and generated antibodies to Nu5GC and the people who didn't get it. And so they compared 173,960 people who did not get rabbit polyclonal IgG to 38,505 patients who did get the rabbit polyclonal IgG. And they say, we found no evidence that exposure to higher levels of anti-Nu5GC is associated with a higher incidence of colon carcinoma. So what they found was that there was no difference in the incidence of colon cancer. These are in kidney transplant patients who had had a big dose of IgG from rabbits with lots of Nu5GC and tons of antibodies. So this study argues strongly against any assertion that Nu5GC is causing any problems in humans. The other interesting study that actually Nathan sent to me a few months ago is titled Gut Bacteria Responding to Dietary Change and Code Sialidases that Exhibit Preference for Red Meat-Associated Carbohydrates. And the takeaway from this study is that in populations of people who eat Nu5GC containing food, that is mostly red meat, it appears that populations of bacteria in the gut microbiome are enriched, specifically Bacteroidetes and Clostridiales, that can break nu5GC down. So they can break nu5GC off of the food we eat and actually use it for food. So it's quite possible that in those of us eating red meat, those of us crushing life and eating red meat and doing really good and loving life because we're eating red meat, we even have bacteria in our guts that are digesting this and preventing it from being any sort of real problem. But in both the kidney induction experiment and in this paper talking about the ability of bacteria in our gut to digest it, it doesn't seem like it's a problem in any way, shape, or form. And as Nathan has pointed out to me in our conversation before this podcast, so many of these criticisms against the carnivore diet don't hold up when we look at the clinical data. There are more and more carnivores who are doing labs, and we do not see a tendency toward inflammation. If this were really a problem, we would see people having big issues, inflammation, and we just don't see that clinically. So many of these things are premature and kind of poorly contrived. Nu5GC reminds me a little bit of TMAO. I feel like once people realized that TMAO wasn't a problem because of red meat, now they're on Nu5GC, right?
Yeah, it's exactly. I think that's a pretty good analogy to draw.
It's just like, man, they're going to need something else. So okay. So that's the Nu5GC story. And the idea there is it's not bad for you. Humans have been eating it for 4 to 6 million years. The other thing that I want to point out about Nu5GC before we move on is that there is evidence that in evolution, there are animals, ferrets and martens are from a specific family of animals, and they don't have Nu5GC either. But they also eat animals that do have Nu5GC. There are not many examples in the natural world of this where animals that don't have Nu5GC eat animals with Nu5GC, but that is a great example. And if Nu5GC were really a problem and the ferrets and martens would be getting colon cancer left and right, they would be probably dying off and their population would evolve or go extinct. Presumably, there would maybe be a mutation and one ferret or marten that didn't have Nu5GC would evolve and take over because there would be such a negative pressure from all the Nu5GC or I should say one ferret or marten that did have Nu5GC would evolve or take over because they're eating all this food that has Nu5GC. But my point with that is that there's no evidence from that population of animals either that eating foods that have Nu5GC when you don't have Nu5GC is a problem, because those ferrets and martens are not dying of colon cancer or being, sort of wiped off the face of the earth because of some sort of genetic environmental mismatch.
Good point.
All right, next question.
All right, let's dive into these questions from your listeners. Is iron overload or hemochromatosis a concern with the carnivore diet?
So I get this question a lot, and I want to go into some detail here for people. The answer, broadly speaking, is no. It's not a problem. So I'm really good friends with Dr. Mercola now, and when I told Dr. Mercola that I was doing a carnivore diet, his first concern was, what is your ferritin? Ferritin is a storage form of iron. And he was concerned about oxidative stress related to excess iron. And I said, my ferritin is between 140 and 160. And the next thing he asked was, what is your GGT? If you guys refer back to the blood work episode that Nathan and I did, you'll know about GGT as gamma-glutamyl transferase. And you'll know that that is sometimes a decent marker of oxidative stress. Well, in the people I work with, in all the labs that I've seen, from people sending me in all of my labs, I've never seen a GGT bump from somebody as they are eating a carnivore diet because of increased levels of ferritin. And I don't think that iron in our diet is problematic from an oxidative stress perspective if we are not genetically predisposed to iron overload. What appears to happen is that our body has an ability to only absorb the iron it needs. And for most of us on a carnivore diet, we're going to be getting a lot of iron, whether it's from liver or kidney or meat. Those are iron-rich foods. But unless we have a polymorphism that I'll talk about in a moment that leads to hemochromatosis, we are able to stop absorbing iron when we don't need any more. It's like so many things in our body, they're so delicate and elegant. Our body can say, no, I'm good, I don't need any more iron, and it can just choose to excrete it without absorbing it. Much like it can do with cholesterol, if it has enough cholesterol and wants to get rid of it, our body can choose to absorb or not. So there is a small number of people who have a polymorphism in a gene called the HFE gene, or the human homeostatic iron regulator protein gene, HFE. And these people are predisposed to hemochromatosis. There are multiple types of hemochromatosis, but what we're talking about now is primary hemochromatosis. That is hemochromatosis, which is iron overload because of a polymorphism in the HFE gene, which causes us to absorb iron avidly and not really have the ability to stop absorbing it when we're exposed to it. So if you've done 23andMe, you will know if you have hemochromatosis because there are very well-defined loci for these polymorphisms. And for the super geeky people out there who want to check this out, if you've done 23andMe and put this into Promethease, it will tell you, or you can look up RS1800562, which is the RSID for this polymorphism for the HFE gene. I know this is getting esoteric, but I know there are some geeks out there who are loving this. This is the C282Y polymorphism in the HFE gene. It's a G to A transformation, and it causes overly avid absorption of iron, which we don't want. So if you have that polymorphism, you need to get checked for iron overload. And how do you do that? You need to get a full iron panel, which is a serum iron, a ferritin, a TIBC, and an iron saturation, or a transferrin sat. Now, if I'm seeing people in my practice and the transferrin sat is above 45%, I get worried. I've seen clients before who had transferrin sats in the 70s, and I was like, you have hemochromatosis. Again, it's rare, but until proven otherwise, if your transferrin sat is above 45, you need to be worked up for this polymorphism in the HFA gene. Now, having said that, usually people with hemochromatosis, we don't get worried until the ferritin is above 1,000 milliequivalents per liter. Or what's the units on that? I have to think of the units on that. The ferritin is over 1,000. Do you know the units on ferritin off the top of your head, Nathan?
I don't know.
Okay. Ferritin is over 1,000. I'll check the units in a moment. That's where we get worried about the hemochromatosis. Now, a lot of carnivores will see their ferritin drift up into like 100, 200. I'm just not worried about it at those ranges unless we see other evidence of oxidative stress, which would be GGT. I would check you could check a glutathione if you were concerned about it, as Chris Masterjohn and I talked about it previously on our podcast a few weeks ago. It's pretty hard to check oxidized versus reduced glutathione, but you can at least check a total glutathione, or if you really wanted to, you could look at oxidized versus reduced. But I do not believe that a ferritin, even 300 or more, is a problem in the absence of a hemochromatosis polymorphism. There is one other caveat to this discussion, and that is the fact that there's another hemochromatosis polymorphism at RS1799945, which is the H63D mutation, or the polymorphism, which is a C to G. And if you have that one, that's a much milder form of hemochromatosis. So what you might need to think about is if your hemochromatosis is when you are homozygous for the C282Y polymorphism. If you have heterozygosity at that position, meaning one gene which is G and one gene which is A, you're probably not going to have a problem over accumulating iron unless you have the H63D polymorphism, which is, again, at that other RSID. So looking at those two things on your Promethease report will tell you, and you can triangulate that with ferritin levels and transferrin sat, serum iron, and TIVC. The last piece of this equation that makes it a little bit complex is that ferritin is an acute phase reactant. And if your ferritin looks high, you should recheck it, or at least check it in combination with an HSCRP. Because if there's inflammation, if you hurt yourself, if you were out surfing and you got scratched on a reef, or you were wrestling a shark, or you were wrestling in jiu-jitsu and your HSCRP is elevated, your ferritin can go up. If you have a cold, your ferritin can go up. So ferritin is an acute phase reactant, and it really can't be checked alone. You need to know more than just the ferritin. And ferritin can vary with inflammation. I know you and I have talked about that in the past, Nathan.
Yep. Yeah, I think we covered some of that in the blood work podcast as well. Folks could check out.
Yeah.
It's a good in-depth answer on that one.
Cool.
And then I guess for premenopausal women, hemochromatosis, not a problem. Men can do therapeutic phlebotomy or donate blood also.
Yes. So the one client of mine who I saw hemochromatosis in was a premenopausal woman. And her ferritin was very low. Her ferritin was in the 20s, but her transferrin sat was 70. And the PCP didn't pick it up. But once we did genetic analysis, we saw that she had hemochromatosis. And she had a history of heavy periods. And so that is protective because it's essentially loss of blood every month. Now, men will get the sequela of hemochromatosis much earlier than women because of this, but it can occur in women postmenopausally because of these problems, because of the cessation of the loss of blood every month. But hemochromatosis is no fun. You don't want it. It's called bronze diabetes. There are problems with liver. There are problems with insulin sensitivity. There are problems with the heart. You can get cardiomyopathy. The skin darkens everywhere. It's a pretty debilitating disease. It can cause increased risk of liver cancers and damage in the liver due to oxidative stress. So it's not a good thing. And if you have it, doesn't mean you can't eat red meat. It means you should just get phlebotomy. No matter what you do with hemochromatosis, you're probably going to overaccumulate iron because you will absorb it so avidly. Now, should someone with hemochromatosis eat more chicken or more fish than red meat? It's a possibility. I would work with your hematologist if you have hemochromatosis and just follow the ferritin and the transferrin sat. Red meat is still an incredibly valuable and nutritious thing. And if you are unable to keep the ferritin where you would like it, even with phlebotomy, then I would eat white meat or chicken, pork. There's a little iron in pork as well, and fish or something that isn't quite as high in iron. But I definitely would not eat spleen if you had hemochromatosis. That is very high in iron. But I do think that someone with hemochromatosis is very likely going to be able to manage it simply by phlebotomy. So you are essentially an incredible blood factory, and you will save many lives by donating your blood to lots of people. And it doesn't mean you really have to change diet a whole lot or that you could not do a carnivore diet. But with the carnivore diet itself, I am not worried about iron overload, and hemochromatosis will not occur in the absence of that polymorphism.
Nice. Next question is, can you share a bit more about the book you're writing and what kind of stuff do you cover in that?
So the book is written, and you can go to my website, Carnivore MD. There's a landing page for the book. I'm going to have pre-sales starting very soon. And so the first 2 chapters of the book are about evolution, and they're about our history as humans. And the hypothesis that I advance in that part of the book is that human brain size increased rapidly 2.5 million years ago. In a couple of weeks, I'm going to have Bill von Hippel on the podcast, and we are going to talk more about this. He is a psychologist and sort of an evolutionary anthropology curious guy, and there are so many adaptations to hunting and human evolution, whether it's the whites of our eyes so that we can see where we are looking and hunt in groups, our incredible throwing arms, our more upright postures, our jaw structure, our big brains happened because of all of this. And it all happened about 2.5 million years ago when the trajectory of brain size took a very radical increase because of what many people feel to be the advent of group hunting. We also see the increase in stone tools at that time and butchering of animals. So the hypothesis I advance in the first chapter of the book is that human brain size increased rapidly because of our consumption of animals, that eating animals made us human. Not fire, that didn't come along for at least another 1,000,000 years, but it was eating animals that made us human. In the second chapter of the book, I talk about the agricultural revolution and how damaging that was for humans. This is the kind of stuff Jared Diamond has called the cult of the seed. In the third chapter of the book, I talk about broad overview of plant toxins. And then in chapters 4, 5, 6, and 7, I go into detail about isothiocyanates. I go into detail about lectins, oxalates, and polyphenols. And the polyphenol chapter is particularly spicy because we talk about this magical molecule, or this molecule that everyone thinks is magical, that is really actually a plant defense chemical, or a set of plant defense chemicals that are bad for us. Examples include curcumin, resveratrol. I'm going to have David Sinclair on the podcast in a couple of weeks, and we will share our differing opinions about resveratrol, or the benefits there or harm thereof. I've spoken about that a little bit in the past. So those are all the chapters on plant toxins. Chapter 8 is a direct comparison of animal and plant nutrients, bioavailability, where they're found, how to get them. And I make the case that animal foods are the clear, better source of nutrition for humans. They are the ultimate multivitamin. They are what we need. And I did illustrate the decreased bioavailability of plant nutrients. This goes a little bit back to Game Changers and the fact that they're claiming you can get all the protein you need from plants. Well, you might be able to get a decent amount of leucine from plants, but all of the amino acids found in plants are much less bioavailable than animal protein if you look at something like a DIAS, or a digestible indispensable amino acid score. So chapter 9 is 9 and 10 are where I debunk many common myths about meat. I just debunk the myths about worsened longevity or harm. I debunk myths about cancer. I debunk the need for fiber. And I debunk all of sort of the negative things that we've been told about meat in detail. Chapter 11 is where I debunk a lot of the previous notions about LDL and cholesterol. And that one is a very in-depth chapter about new hypotheses around cholesterol and sort of the way that I strongly believe LDL is not what's hurting us, but it's rather insulin resistance. And we go into lots of detail there. I talk about new 5GC. I talk about TMAO. I break it all down. Chapter 12 is where we get into the nuts and bolts of a carnivore diet. I'll tell you how to do it and give you the 5 tiers of how to eat a carnivore diet. Chapter 13 is common questions and pitfalls. And that chapter is 15,000 to 17,000 words, depending on how I'm editing it. So that's a long chapter. So chapter 12 and 13 could be a book all by themselves. Those 2 chapters alone are 30,000 words. If people aren't familiar, so my whole book is probably going to be over 100,000 words, which means it might be 400 plus pages. There are more than 450 references in the book. It's very well documented. I've tried my best to create a strong thesis for this way of eating. And then chapter 14 is a conclusion in which I talk about environmental impact. I discuss some of the environmental data, the carbon cycle, the actual data from the EPA regarding what cows produce and what they don't, and the impact from ruminants in the planet. And then I close with sort of an appeal to ancestral norms. So I'm excited. Be on the lookout soon, guys, for a pre-order link for that.
That'll be quite the tome. That sounds like something I'll have to read. You'll have to hook me up with an early copy or something.
I'll get you a signed copy, bro.
Even better. All right, let's move on to the next question. How does the microbiota look after a long time on strict carnivore? How about the diversity? Generally, people would suggest you need a wide variety of plant matter to maintain diversity. That's from Niklas in Sweden.
Okay, yeah. So this is often talked about, and in the previous questions, in the previous discussions with Tommy Wood, I've talked about this as well. I really think that Tommy is right, and I would agree with Tommy on the fact that we do not know what a healthy microbiome is. There are some, and in fact, I've got an interview with Michael Ruscio for his podcast tomorrow. I'm excited to sort of have a little back and forth with him about the non-need for plant fiber to create a healthy microbiome. But
we do not know what a healthy microbiome looks like for humans. We can pretty much say what an unhealthy microbiome looks like. Lots of proteobacteria, lots of gram-negative anaerobes, a high calprotectin or inflammation in the gut. But the gut microbiome you have when you are healthy is likely your healthy gut microbiome. We cannot say that we need this amount of lactobacillus or this amount of bifido or this ratio between this species and that species. And one person is going to be totally healthy and have a certain amount of Faecobacteria prausnitzii. Another person can be totally healthy and have zero Faecobacterium prausnitzii. The microbiome is a system unlike any other that we have encountered in medicine, and it is much more complex than we are being led to believe by the mainstream media. It is simply not as cut and dry as you need more of this bacteria and less of this bacteria. There's a web. And so anyone who says the carnivore diet is not bad, is not good, because we know we need plant fiber to get lactobacillus or bifidobacteria, is really making conjecture. There is no evidence for this. And there's a large amount of clinical evidence and experiential evidence from the community that, by and large, GI issues resolve on this diet. Gas, bloating, constipation go away. If eliminating fiber, plant fiber from our diet, which is usually the main criticism, were really a bad thing, then why would so many people feel so much better from a GI perspective? Another thing to add to this, there are multiple studies that show that in hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza, there is no bifidobacteria. So any conception of what is good or bad bacteria, like I said, we can pretty much tell what the bad ones are, but we don't know what looks good. And you definitely don't need bifidobacteria to be healthy, because the Hadza don't even have it. In terms of diversity, this term gets thrown around a lot because of a series of studies that were done comparing rural people in Uganda with urban folks in, or maybe it was Burkina Faso. They were urban Italians with rural Africans. And they saw that the people in rural parts of the world were having a higher diversity in the microbiome. And they're looking at alpha diversity, which is an ecological measure of the number of different species in an ecosystem. Now, there are multiple problems with looking at diversity. The first of which is that just diversity scores tell us nothing about the health of the microbiome. And we can have a lot of diversity with a lot of bad bacteria. Like I said earlier, we know what the bad ones are. You can have a high diversity score, and I've seen this, and have tons of proteobacteria around. So having a high diversity score does not mean that you're healthy. Having a high diversity score, I should say the reverse. Having a low diversity score is probably not a great thing, but what we actually see when we look at carnivores is that, and these are human carnivores that have tested, they have extremely high diversity scores. If you look at the literature, and I believe I talked about this, I don't think this came up in the debate with Lane, though I had this study ready to pounce on him, is that fiber does not increase alpha diversity. And ketogenic diets in kids for epilepsy do not decrease alpha diversity. So the pundits advancing fiber from plants on the grounds that you need this to increase alpha diversity are not citing all of the evidence. That is not true. Plant fiber does not increase alpha diversity. Removal of fiber does not decrease alpha diversity. And there are more and more anecdotes or citizen scientists like Nathan, for instance, who are checking their microbiome and finding high diversity scores. You said you did Ubiome, right? Although they're defunct now.
Yeah, Nick and I did Ubiome, and we both had very high diversity scores. I think they moved from a 100-point scale to a 10-point scale. So I believe our diversity would put us in the 85th percentile.
Both of you?
Yep.
So you guys are both high diversity. I've seen people post about this on Twitter. I know that Bart Kay recently had someone on his podcast, and they went over her entire microbiome, and she had a high diversity. So what we know is that in people with diabetes and insulin resistance, they tend to have a lower diversity score. We can't just say that all high diversities are good, but what we have seen in carnivores repeatedly now is that the diversity scores do not seem to go down. So I would love to debate Chris Kresser or any of the people that say that plant fiber is necessary. I'll probably bring this up to Michael Ruscio tomorrow on his podcast, but I'm not convinced it's necessary at all to have plant fiber for high diversity or a healthy gut. Now, this also can segue into discussions of short-chain fatty acids. And on the podcast I did with Dave Asprey on Bulletproof, we talked about this as well. Short-chain fatty acids can be made from protein just as well as carbohydrates. These are fuel for colonic epithelial cells and include butyrate is the main one that people think about, but we don't just need butyrate. We can make isobutyrate, we can make propionate, you can make acetate, and these can all be made from protein just as well as they can be made from carbohydrates. And specifically, we know in animal studies, there's a great study with cheetah, that we can make short-chain fatty acids from collagenous tissue. So we're back to the collagen. We're back to the idea we need to eat connective tissue from animals. If you're only eating lean muscle meat, you probably want to try and get some of the grizzly bits or tendons or make tendon soup, because that can be fermented in your gut into short-chain fatty acids.
Nice. Good answer. Let's see what the next question is. This person is asking about how much potassium they should get. They were trying to get 4.7 grams, 4,700 milligrams, whether through food or supplementation. They read that they needed more potassium and sodium, but everything else that they've read said they need more sodium and not enough potassium. They feel great when they add 2.5 teaspoons of citrate and some pink salt and some real salt. But they want to make sure their potassium isn't too high. So I guess, what do you think about potassium supplementation? Is it necessary? Sodium supplementation, et cetera?
So this we can go back to the Marty Kendall's nutrient optimizer here as well. So the potassium and sodium question comes up a lot. One of the striking things for most people to learn about a carnivore diet is that it's a pretty high potassium diet. And it's probably more about the balance between potassium and sodium than it is about any one of those nutrients or minerals in and of itself or by itself, right? So I think that we want to try and keep our potassium and sodium in some sort of a relative balance. We don't want them to get too far out of balance, but the recommendations that we need tons and tons of potassium don't make a whole lot of sense to me. Let's back up. A pound of red meat has 1,500-ish milligrams of potassium. Most of us in the carnivore world are eating at least a pound of meat per day. Many are eating 2 to 3 pounds of meat per day. So for me right now, I've recently upped my protein a little bit. I'm eating about 2 pounds of meat plus per day. I'm getting 3,000 milligrams of potassium just from meat. And then liver is quite high in potassium. Kidney is quite high in potassium. I'm probably getting 3,500 milligrams of potassium a day easily. And I think that for most people, you want to just try and balance that with sodium. And then the question becomes, how much salt do we need? How much salt should we be eating? The takeaway from the potassium discussion is there is plenty of potassium in your food if you are eating any reasonable quantity of meat. There's lots of potassium in there, and it's in the meat. It's very rich in meat. Sodium is a more interesting question. I've gone round and round about this with Tommy Wood and some other friends trying to figure this out. If you look at animal meat, there's only about 400 milligrams of sodium per pound. So 1,500 milligrams of potassium, 400 milligrams of sodium. Sodium is primarily an extracellular mineral, whereas potassium is an intracellular mineral. Potassium's higher in the cell, sodium's higher in the blood. A liter of blood has about 3 grams of sodium, so 3,000 milligrams of sodium, but most of us don't eat blood anymore. Our ancestors might have had a little more blood than us. I think they probably would have, but that would have been their real only source of sodium. I'm also going to have James DiNicolantonio on the podcast soon. I must disagree with James. I just don't think our ancestors would have had that much access to sodium. I don't think we would have had salt licks that often, maybe seafood, but if you actually look at seafood, it's not that salty. I think a few oysters only has, a couple hundred milligrams. I think 6 oysters only has a couple hundred milligrams of sodium in them. So you're not going to get that much salt from seafood. You could get a little bit, but evolutionarily, the ranges of salt consumption that I think would have been most consistent for humans are probably between 1,500 milligrams and 3,000 milligrams a day of sodium, not sodium chloride, of sodium. Now, that's 1 to 3 grams of sodium per day. That's between 2 and 6 grams of salt per day. So 2 to 6 grams of sodium chloride. We're mixing our units here. There's a teaspoon measure as well. Teaspoon is about 4 grams. So a teaspoon of salt is 4 grams of salt. 4 grams of salt is 2 grams of sodium. So let's just talk sodium and potassium and not talk about the salt with the chloride anion. So I'm getting 3,000 plus milligrams of potassium. And then in a day, I'm probably eating, I would say probably 2,000 to 2,500 milligrams of sodium, not sodium chloride, sodium, which means I'm probably getting 4 grams of salt per day. And I think that's about what our ancestors would have done, somewhere in that range. And when you do that, your sodium is balanced with your potassium. It's like 1 to 1. I'm sometimes even getting less sodium than I am potassium per day. And I think that's all you need to do is balance your sodium and your potassium. The concern with low potassium is that it might lead to high blood pressure. And so I talked about this on the podcast with Chris Masterjohn a little bit. If you have high blood pressure, you might want to think about this. But if you're normotensive and your serum sodium is normal and your red blood cell sodium, and your serum potassium is normal and your red blood cell potassium is normal, then you're probably fine with potassium. And I actually think a lot of people don't need to supplement potassium. In this question, Deb is asking, she's taking a lot of potassium. I would not take that much potassium. She's taking 2.5 teaspoons of potassium citrate, which is quite a bit. Now, potassium citrate has a citrate on it, and it's not going to have as much potassium as you think. I'd have to do the calculations and look at the label, but I suspect that 2.5 teaspoons of potassium citrate is only about 1,000 milligrams of potassium that she's getting in that 12 grams of potassium citrate, because most of it is citrate. What I would say with regard to sodium and potassium is balance them. Think about how much sodium you're getting. Think about how much potassium you're getting. And you probably want that ratio to be about 1 to 1, or maybe a little more potassium than sodium. And that just means not overdoing it on the sodium. I do think electrolytes are important. I think we need more sodium. I don't think we should get 0 sodium, but I suspect that in the past, once I got out of the transitional phase into ketosis, I probably was doing too much sodium for a while. And I think that when we transition into ketosis, we're going to need more sodium because we're acutely wasting. Insulin sensitivity hasn't quite changed enough to conserve the sodium with lower levels of insulin. But once we're adapted, I honestly think that between 2 and 4 grams, maybe even 2 to 3 grams of sodium, which is double that for sodium chloride, is all we're going to need, and we can balance that with potassium. How much salt do you think you're eating a day right now, Nathan?
Probably about the same as you. I just add salt to taste, and I might even back off of that. I was talking with Siobhan Huggins at this conference about that. She actually just doesn't really salt anything anymore, and she finds that she drinks considerably less. So I think you actually end up just wasting less.
Oh yeah, I think that's very true. You definitely waste less. There are studies. So what's interesting is that there are studies showing that when we restrict sodium too low, we can become insulin resistant. And what will happen is insulin will go up and aldosterone will go up. And so we don't want that to happen. But in those studies, that cutoff happens around 500 milligrams of sodium. And by the time some people are given, I'd say 1,000 milligrams of sodium, it's totally normalized. You don't see any increased insulin resistance with 1,000 milligrams of sodium. Now, if Siobhan is not doing any sodium and she's doing meat, then I think that she'll probably get enough sodium as long as she is eating a pound plus of meat per day and maybe a little bit of seafood. But we don't want to go too low on sodium. Definitely, we can go too low. And if somebody's only eating plants and did not add any salt, there would be a major problem there, and your body would freak out trying to conserve that. We need some. The question is, how much can we do? But yeah, I'm trying to understand what an ancestrally consistent level of salt is. And the reason I'm adjusting it up from the meat a little bit is I think that the meat we would have eaten previously would have been fresher and had more sodium because there would have been more blood. and we might have had blood occasionally. So I think that, like I said, evolutionarily, right now, my sense is that we had about 1,000 milligrams of sodium, maybe 2,000 milligrams of sodium per day.
Makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and that balances it with potassium. The other electrolyte people always think about is magnesium, and I think they're all connected. And I'll go into that on another AMA in the future. But the short takeaway is that I think if we're eating sensible amounts of potassium and sodium in our food, we should not need to supplement magnesium. Unless we are very deficient from prior to a carnivore diet or prior to whatever diet we're doing. I know a lot of people supplement magnesium. I've experimented with it in the past, and I just haven't found it to be that helpful, either for whatever. And I've just found the most help for me, the most helpful intervention for me has been just eating a reasonable amount of salt, and not overdoing it, but some, and thinking about where my potassium is coming from. And then also, I think you and I probably have talked about this in the past, maybe not, maybe it was on a different podcast. I think that the major source of magnesium that we would have had evolutionarily was water, and spring water, mineral water is a much better source of magnesium than tap water. So if people have poor tap water, they may need to supplement with magnesium a little bit, but I'm not convinced that we need to do it on what I will call a well-constructed carnivore diet.
That makes sense. You mentioned Marty Kendall, and one of our questions is about his blog post that he wrote doing an analysis of your diet. And you got a 86%, so he gave you a B+. Do you want to address what he thought you were deficient in? And I think we covered a good bit of this in our previous podcast about the carnivore diet qualms or issues. But you want to respond to this one?
Yeah, Marty's got a website, Optimizing Nutrition, and he did a pretty good post about my version of a carnivore diet. One of the things that's funny is that everybody's diet's always changing, and I'm always modifying. I'm a little different than I was when I did this one, but you can look it up. If you just look up like Marty Kendall, Carnivore, Paul Saladino on Google, you'll see it. But I wanted to answer some of the things that he noted in here as deficiencies, which I don't think are accurate characterizations of nutrient bioavailability on a real diet. So, Marty has this program that his goal is to get people lots of these nutrients. And if you look at the diet of mine that he analyzed, he thought that I would be deficient in a couple of things. One of them was vitamin K, which is kind of silly. I think he used Chronometer. Yeah, he used Chronometer. The problem with Chronometer for calculating much of this stuff is that much of this has not been measured in meat, right? So on everything that I told him I ate, which was at that time a little more than a pound of meat, liver, egg yolks, kidney, and some suet, he only calculated that I was getting 2.7 milligrams of vitamin C per day, which is absurdly low. And I mentioned this to him. Like, we know there's much more vitamin C than that in meat. Whether or not how much we need is a question of future debate, and I'm sure that'll continue to be a debate between James DiNicolantonio and Chris Masterjohn and I. But the calculation for vitamin C is abysmally low, and most of what we've calculated for the meats and stuff is grossly inaccurate. I mean, you and I, Nathan, had talked about this on a previous podcast. There are multiple studies that show that a pound of red meat has between 10 and 15 milligrams of vitamin C. A few ounces of liver has probably 20 to 30 milligrams of vitamin C.
Yeah, I think his numbers for vitamin E are too low. Vitamin D, depending if you're eating pasture-raised eggs, that would increase your K2, and he only looked at K1.
Exactly.
Potassium, I think the RDA is completely insane for potassium.
Yeah, I don't even know. Yeah, I don't even think there's an actual RDA for potassium anymore. He calculated.
The one that they tend to use is like 4,700 milligrams, which is
exactly.
a ton. And I don't think anyone ever gets that much potassium unless they're supplementing on any diet.
Yes. When we did this one, he thought that my potassium was at 2,300 milligrams a day. I think it's more than that now. And he calculated my sodium at 6,500 milligrams a day, which I think is much too high. Again, he also came up with a manganese of 0.7, which I think is too low. I definitely incorporate some seafood like mussels from time to time. I don't think I'm deficient in manganese, nor have I ever seen any carnivore deficient in manganese. He gave me an iodine of 0, which is a little bit absurd because considering there's definitely iodine in egg yolks. And, he only can look at one day of my diet on which I didn't eat any seafood. The vitamin E kind of irks me because when I've checked my vitamin E levels, they are very high. So then you can just do a blood alpha tocopherol level. My blood levels of vitamin E are very robust. I know Rhonda Patrick has criticized the carnivore diet because of vitamin E in the past. There is no problem with vitamin E in carnivores. I can assure you of that. And vitamin D is kind of silly because nobody gets that from their diet, or people only get a little bit from their diet, right? Like I'm mostly getting that from the sun. The vitamin K
you can
is
get
also,
it from pork fat, from egg yolks, from cod liver oil, sardines. I'm not sure how much you'd get, but I know that you're in San Diego and spending all kinds of time in the sun, and your vitamin D is just fine. So
it'll be just fine. Yeah, it'll be just
getting almost 50% of your RDA from food that are poorly measured. That's pretty good.
Yeah, and then you're right. Vitamin K so often is only measured as K1. And one of the things I've spoken about repeatedly is that K1 is worthless compared to K2. I don't think humans can convert K1 to K2. I did a whole talk at Ancestral Health Symposium about this, about the importance of animal fat as a source of fat-soluble vitamins. That's on YouTube if you guys want to see it. I reposted it to my YouTube channel. You can check it out. But I definitely do not have a deficiency in vitamin K. That's for sure. Marty was a little concerned about my zinc to copper ratio. I don't get as worried about this. I also don't eat quite that much liver anymore, and perhaps we can talk about the liver question before we wrap up for today. But the presence of zinc in my diet from muscle meat protects me against copper deficiency or copper excess, is what I should say. So the presence of zinc in my diet protects me against copper excess because both of those two metals are stored in the metallothionein proteins in the small intestinal lining, and they're sloughed off together. It's unlikely that anyone is going to get a copper overload from eating lots of liver because there's also zinc in it, and you're getting zinc in muscle meat. Marty talks about the potassium-sodium ratio. We talked about that a little more. We talked about that previously. I don't think that's a problem based on what we talked about there. And he's worried about, not getting enough potassium. This is a common criticism, people, of carnivore diets, saying, you're not getting enough potassium. You need more potassium from plant foods. But I just don't think that that's the case at all. I don't think we need that. I don't think there's any real interventional data, any real functional mechanistic data to suggest that we need so much potassium or a huge potassium to sodium ratio. I think as long as you're getting reasonable amounts of both, you're fine. He talks about my calcium to magnesium ratio. Again, I think this is kind of a little bit too myopic. I do think that we can get plenty of potassium on a carnivore diet with things like bone meal, and I incorporate that sometimes into my diet. And the magnesium I'm getting, he calculated my daily magnesium per day was, what is he saying here? 422 milligrams a day, but he's only calling that 34%. That seems like it's a little bit off. But magnesium, the RDA for magnesium is 400 milligrams a day. He's just saying that my calcium to magnesium ratio is imbalanced and I'm getting too much calcium relative to magnesium. But I think, again, this is a little too myopic. We can get a little bit.
Stop crunching on all those eggshells.
I know. I stopped eating those eggshells. I don't eat eggshells anymore. I don't think he put it in here. I don't do eggshells anymore. I found them to be too constipating. But if people like them and they can use them as a calcium source, I just get occasionally a good bone meal from time to time, and I'll get lots of magnesium in Gerolsteiner spring water, which has 1,000 milligrams of Gerolstein, 1,000 milligrams of magnesium per liter. So if you have 2 or 3 liters of magnesium, you're almost all the way to your RDA. Right there from your water. The omega-6
I guess go for it.
The omega-6 to omega-3 ratio, he thought was, where did he think I was?
He thought it was pretty high, 6, but I called him out on this on Twitter because I think all the data here is garbage too, because you're eating grass-fed meat and pastured eggs, and I think that this is not an accurate number at all. Yeah,
and so that's the problem with most of what Marty is saying. Is that it's based on garbage numbers. So this is the main hesitation that I have with this type of overly myopic look into these nutrients is like, man, we just don't have a ton of good data here. We need to redo this, and maybe you and I will soon, Nathan, get real accurate data of what's in these foods to share with people. But for now, I think that we're on the right track. I think we should look at nutrients, and I appreciate these types of conversations with Marty and Chris Masterjohn, but I'm just not convinced that this is that most of this is a very accurate representation of what he is hoping it will be because of inconsistencies previously. He does talk about methionine-glycine ratio, which is something I think about a lot. And the methionine-glycine ratio was fine. I think we should get lots of glycine in connective tissue. I don't think we necessarily need to do collagen per se if we're getting connective tissue in the steaks. But if we're only eating lean steaks, it's hard to know because some steaks have more connective tissue in them than others. But I think we need to keep that in consideration. And going back to our first discussions about game changers, there are studies that show that methionine overfeeding in monkeys can cause impairment in flow-mediated dilatation. That can be rescued by supplementation with folate or supplementation with glycine. And so yet another reason to think about your methionine-glycine ratio. I actually don't think that many people on a carnivore diet or ketogenic diet are getting tons of methionine or anything that's terribly imbalanced, but you would not want to take like a methionine supplement and overdo it from that perspective. And I think that if we're just getting some connective tissue in our diet, we'll be fine. Homocysteine is probably the reason that FMD gets disordered when we do methionine overfeeding. And the way to improve your homocysteine is riboflavin, generally speaking. Foods that are rich in riboflavin are liver and kidney. Certainly folate is important, and I've talked about MTHFR. I had a whole podcast with Ben Lynch about that if you have questions. But if your homocysteine is elevated, you need to know why, and you need to correct that because that will impair FMD as well. I will also mention that my nutrient optimizer score was much better than Sean Baker's, who wasn't getting enough of many things, but that we'll leave that for a separate discussion. Maybe I'll get Sean on the podcast and he and I can debate nutritional adequacy of a meat-only carnivore diet. I definitely, as anyone listening to this will know, want to get organs in my diet. So
that would be fun.
Yeah, I know. I don't know if Sean would do it. All right, so that's
we can
Marty.
Roll that into the next question, which was Marty says that you're getting 15 times the RDA for vitamin A. And someone asked if there was any risk of toxicity with vitamin A from a carnivore diet, eating nose to tail.
Yeah, so this is a great question. It comes up a lot. I don't think we know. I think that I've eaten a lot of liver in the past and not had any negative side effects. But the more I think about it, I'm not sure that our ancestors would have always had 4 to 5 ounces of liver to eat every day for the rest of their life. I think that it is very, very hard to get vitamin A toxicity from food and from reasonable amounts of liver. Unless someone is eating a pound of liver every day, and that's the only thing they're eating, I just don't see it happening. I certainly do not worry about vitamin A toxicity from someone eating an ounce or 2 of liver per day, or even up to as much as a pound of liver per week, I would say is the top end. I think that there's very little vitamin A in most of the other parts of the animal. There's some vitamin A in kidney, but it's much lower than liver. Liver is really the only thing that we need to even think about. If we look at the polar bear studies, which are so famous, and they're really sort of the stuff of historical lore, polar bear liver is like 10,000 times higher in vitamin A than beef liver. And so it's not even the same sort of thing. And people got doses of vitamin A that were in the range of hundreds of thousands of IUs of vitamin A all at one time. So is it possible that eating 300,000 IU of vitamin A or 1 million IU of vitamin A at one time in the form of 17 pounds of beef liver or in the form of a few ounces of polar bear liver could be a problem for people? Yeah, it certainly could be. But I think that generally speaking, reasonable amounts of liver are only going to increase our health, and that would be an ounce or 2 a day. I would set the upper limit at like a pound of liver per week. I don't think people need that much, but the organ that I've been appreciating a lot recently is kidney. Kidney has just as much riboflavin, vitamin K2 and folate as liver, but much less vitamin A. So I feel totally safe consuming 3 to 4 ounces a day. I think a lot about riboflavin and folate because I do have an MTHFR polymorphism myself. I think a lot of people are deficient in riboflavin, and liver and kidney are a great source of that. So no, I wouldn't worry about it too much. And I've seen clients who didn't seem to have any problems eating 3 to 4 ounces of liver every day for months and months and months. So I don't think we fully know. There are case reports of people, or I shouldn't say case reports. There are case studies or case series, or there are research articles beyond those suggesting that higher intakes of vitamin A in pregnancy above 10,000 IU per day is associated with an increased risk of birth defects. But I think it's very hard for the researchers to sort out how much of that is coming from diet and how much is coming from supplements. There is one study that I found in the past suggesting that supplemental vitamin A palmitate, is absorbed differently in our guts than vitamin A in the retinol form, which is what we find in food. That is done in pigs, but when they gave pigs liver and they gave pigs vitamin A palmitate, they certainly saw differential absorption, with the vitamin synthetic form being much more avidly absorbed than the actual quote unquote natural form. So I think that vitamin A overdose is much more common from supplements. I actually do not recommend vitamin A supplementation to anyone from a supplement. I would never take vitamin A palmitate in any way, shape, or form, unless there were a clinical deficiency that someone were really trying to correct and didn't have access to real food like liver. I think from food, it's very unusual, very unlikely that anyone will get an overdose of vitamin A.
Nice. That's good. I'm sure people will be happy to hear that. What do you think about the carnivore diet for folks with gallstones?
So this is quite an interesting question. I wrote about this in my book. We'll wrap it up on this one or the next one, but gallstones are interesting. There are multiple types of gallstones, but the main type of gallstone is a cholesterol stone. And these are formed usually when there's an imbalance in the amount of cholesterol and phosphatidylcholine and bile salts in the bile. Now, or I should say bile and cholesterol in the bile. I think that the majority of cholesterol stones happen because people are choline deficient. In the bile is composed of cholesterol, bile acids, and bilirubin. 3 things. And the relative proportions of those are what determine whether there will be a precipitation and a enucleation reaction forming the gallstones. When there are not enough bile salts, cholesterol can precipitate out and form gallstones, forming cholesterol gallstones. The reason that we don't have enough bile salts is because we can't put them into the bile, because the transport of bile salts from the liver where they are made is a choline-dependent mechanism. I think that people get gallstones generally because they are choline deficient. If we don't get enough choline, that is from animal meat, animal organs, egg yolks, etc., no one on a carnivore diet or eating an animal-based diet should be deficient in choline, but anyone concerned about TMAO and eating a plant-based diet or limiting their consumption of animal foods could certainly become deficient in choline, could end up with a bile salt imbalance or a cholesterol to bile salt imbalance in the bile, which could lead to gallstones. This, I think, is what is misunderstood and leads to thousands of gallbladders coming out every day. These poor gallbladders are just getting mowed down. It's so sad. And they don't need to come out. But if you have gallstones already, how do gallstones get treated? They get treated with bile salts. They get treated with synthetic bile salts. And these are given to them by patients, by surgeons, ursodeoxycholic acid, things like this. These are bile salts. Well, the way to get rid of your bile salts is, the way to get rid of your gallstones is to make more bile salts. The way to make more bile salts is to eat a diet that is rich in choline. The richest diet that I know in choline is a carnivore diet. Meat, eggs, liver, kidney. This is where you get choline from. If you were concerned about gallstones and you wanted to get rid of them, you might get a prescription for a bile acid supplement. But I do not think a carnivore diet is going to be bad for somebody with gallstones. Now, there is a possibility that if you have gallstones, you could lodge one in the neck of the gallbladder. That's a problem. That's what leads to cholecystitis. Cholelithiasis is when you have gallstones in the gallbladder. Cholecystitis is when they occlude the aperture of the gallbladder and it gets infected. I don't think a carnivore diet is going to lead to occlusion of the gallbladder any more than any other diet. It's just kind of a luck of the draw or misluck of the draw that a stone gets stuck in the gallbladder neck. Now, If you have gallstones, I would assume that you're already choline deficient and you'd want to supplement your diet with choline, eating choline-rich foods. I think a carnivore diet might actually be the best thing for someone with gallstones to increase the choline content, to increase the bile acid content in the bile, and to help dissolve those stones. But I don't see gallstones as a contraindication. I see gallstones as an indication that there is a major deficiency in the diet.
That makes a lot of sense. I think, that's good stuff. Let's see. What question should we do next?
So we got one more probably.
I think an interesting one is about foods your thoughts on various foods that aren't quite plants, but aren't animals either. I think that's one that I've heard people ask about a lot. So let's see. People have asked about insects, mushrooms, seaweed, chlorella, algae, tea and coffee, and honey.
Okay.
I guess, do you want to step through those quickly?
Yeah, we'll dance through them. So insects, somebody says, what are your thoughts on insects? Have you tried any? I've had crickets in the past, or cricket flour. I like it. I think it's great. Every time I eat like crab or shrimp, I sort of feel like I'm eating insects anyway. But I think eating insects is fine. In another part of the world, in another culture, I'm sure I would do it. I've always kind of wanted to eat grubs. Apparently they taste like bacon. Apparently they're really good. I would definitely eat insects. In the westernized world, we don't really have access to great insects. I think they're very nutritious. They have chitin, they have calcium, they're a good source of collagen. I think if you want to eat insects, that's great. I don't know a ton about them. I remember seeing an episode of Bear Grylls where he said you had to cook crickets because crickets can have a tapeworm. So I wouldn't eat raw crickets, but I would definitely cook crickets for sure. Let's do it. You guys should all come on my hunting trip in January. I'm going to be posting about that soon, and we'll eat some cooked crickets. The mushrooms are something that I also talk about in the book. Mushrooms are not plants technically, but they still are rooted in the ground, and they still appear to have defense mechanisms. There's a whole class of mushrooms called the agaricus mushrooms, which are the white button mushrooms, which have a toxin in them called agaritine. Now, agaritine appears to be mostly degraded by cooking, but you would not want to eat a white button mushroom, a cremini mushroom, a portobello mushroom raw. You'll get some agaritine. Your body can detoxify it, but don't eat a toxin that you know of. Now, my impression is that mushrooms also don't want to get eaten, and generally there's nothing in mushrooms I'm aware of that you can't get otherwise. I should do a whole podcast. I've been trying to get Paul Stamets on my podcast. If any of you guys know him, please have him get in touch with me. There is some preliminary research. There may be compounds that are beneficial for us in mushrooms, but I fear that they will fall into the same sort of pattern as plant compounds, that will find some benefit for mushroom-related compounds, and then eventually we will find other places in the body where they are harmful for us because they are not from the operating system that we're doing, which is mammals. Right? This is a concept I talked about in the past, the fact that plant compounds can look beneficial for humans if we only look at one thing that they do. But if we expand our lens and look at where they are acting in the whole body, we often see collaterally damaging effects. We see negative effects, whether it's sulforaphane, whether it's resveratrol, whether it's curcumin. These compounds all have what are we could consider side effects. They're not technically side effects, but they all have regions in the body or mechanisms in the body where they're damaging for humans. But we're only told about the benefits. So I think we need to be very careful with that with mushrooms. And I think that the jury's out. I don't think we necessarily need mushrooms. I don't see them as any unique source of nutrients. In a survival situation, would I eat mushrooms? Sure. But in a survival situation, I also might eat plants because plants are survival food. Honey, the indigenous people throughout the world who eat honey get really bad dental problems. I'm not a fan of it. If you want to use it as a carbohydrate from time to time, you can. Seaweed can be really contaminated with heavy metals from the ocean or even radiation, etc.
Also, it's a plant.
Seaweed, yeah. Well, it's an algae, right? Is it? Yeah.
I thought it was just a plant. I don't know. I thought it wasn't like a single cell thing, like an algae. I'm not
a
biologist, though.
It could be different. Yeah. I think that seaweed, I don't think is any unique source of nutrients for humans. Chlorella and algae can also be contaminated with metals. People say, oh, chlorella helps us bind things. I'm not convinced it represents a unique part of human nutrition. I think it could be a very good
algae also don't want to be eaten because there's various types of toxic algae that you hear about. In fact, I think there's a bloom of it in Green Lake in Seattle right now.
There's tons of toxic algae. So we have to be careful of that. And then tea I've talked about in the past because of tannins, which are digestive enzyme inhibitors and can probably be irritating and damaging to the gut. I've heard a lot of people say they have trouble digesting things and they are drinking tea after their meal. And I'm thinking that could be a real problem. Tannins in tea are digestive enzyme inhibitors. Tea is not benign. You're brewing leaves and getting all those plant compounds into the tea. It's probably not great for humans. Coffee I've talked about separately. I have a whole chapter or at least a part of the book about coffee. So, all right, you guys, we should wrap it up. Thank you so much, Nathan.
You got time for a super speed round? I think a couple of these questions we could answer in about a minute.
Wait, I got 45 seconds.